Welcome to the Squirrel Tale. On the second episode of my Basics of Muzzleloader series, I will be discussing the basic parts of a muzzleloader and some things to consider when buying your first muzzleloader. But before we get started, if you like this sort of thing, make sure you hit that like button so more people can get this video. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be focusing on cap locks and flintlocks of the traditional design. Like these three. Sorry, wheel lock fans. That's for another video. So the basic parts are barrel, stock, lock, trigger, sights, and the ramrod. Now the stock, I'm counting the trigger guard and butt plate and the patch box in with the stock. Let's start with discussing the barrel. Now the barrel, they come in various calibers, and they range from 32 to 75. Typically, there are exceptions. They also come in both smooth bore and rifled. This Brown Bess is a smooth bore. As you can see, this barrel here, along with the other two, is rifled. You know, the rifling improves accuracy, as many of you know, and our grooves cut in the barrel. They also come in a wide range of different lengths, from short, sometimes under 20 inches, to longer ones like the Brown Bess and long rifle. And another thing is, some of them, you have round barrels, you have straight octagon barrels, you also have swamp barrels. A swamp barrel is like this one, where if you can see, it's wide in the end, but as you come through, it gets narrower, and it's at its narrowest point right here, and gradually gets biggest in the breech. And it also flares a little bit at the end. That way your sights are semi-close to level. They're not exactly level, but closer, as compared to just a straight taper. The reason for this is this puts the weight in the rear of the gun. You have more mass towards the back, behind your front arm. And a good swamp barrel will have your balance point be right where your front arm goes, making it a very stable gun to shoot. Now the stock is what holds all the other parts together and makes it comfortable to shoot. There are thousands of different styles of stock. Next you have the trigger. The trigger, you have two main types of trigger. You have set triggers and basic single triggers. Now a basic simple trigger works like most triggers. You pull it and the hammer drops and discharges the gun. Now a set trigger, on the other hand, that works by having a rear trigger that you pull back. I'm putting this in there to keep the nipple protected. You'll pull that trigger back, and then you just touch that front trigger, and it goes off. So that front trigger is super light, making for a very clean break, and makes the gun easier to shoot accurately. Next thing I want to discuss is the sights. Now, on muzzleloaders, your sights can range from something like the Brown Bess, which really doesn't even have sights, but you have what is the bayonet lug, which you can kind of reference to get a sight picture, up to screw adjustable peep sights. The most common are V-notch sights like that with a blade front. That's probably the most common you'll find on muzzleloaders. And there's different variations on them, like buckhorns and things like that. And they have different advantages depending on your preference. The ramrod is pretty self-explanatory. That's a rod used to load the gun and clean the gun, located under the barrel. And then the next thing is the lock. A flintlock uses a piece of flint to ignite the flash pan. Now I don't have flash power in it, but you can see when I do that, a shower of sparks go off, and that will ignite the flash pan, igniting the main charge. They were invented around the early 1600s and saw use until the early 1800s, so they had about a 200-year service life. The percussion uses a cap to ignite it. You take one of these caps, they're made by CCI, Remington, and some others, and back in the day they weren't, and they go on the nipple here, like that. And then I do have this point in a safe direction. You pull the trigger and they will ignite the gun. You know, that shoots down flame into your powder charge. A very simple mechanism that was brought on by the invention of these. And it wasn't long after the invention of these that someone got the idea to put them in a cartridge. And that's how we got our cartridge guns of today. So that's the two basic kinds of locks you have. And really, your fundamental parts of a flintlock. So, now I'm going to discuss what features you should look into when buying your first muzzleloader. The first thing I want to discuss is whether or not you should go flintlock or cap lock. There's several advantages to a flintlock. The first is that there's often time, depending on where you are, extra hunting seasons you can hunt with it. That I know that's the case in PA, and I think maybe a few other states. We have a flintlock season. Now, if you get a flintlock, you can hunt that late season with it, and you can also hunt the early season, but with a cap lock, you can only hunt the early season. So that is one thing. You might have more hunting opportunities than you would with other ones. And I think in general, most other muzzleloading seasons, a flintlock is always safe to use. I mean, I'm not an expert on every state's hunting law, but I feel like that's likely the case. The other thing I always say about flintlocks and it's hard to describe without shooting one, but there's just something so cool about them. It's lead, powder, flint, there's no metal caps, there's nothing like that. It's just to the basics. The flash that goes off, very cool, looks cool. And to be able to take a deer with one just feels awesome. The flintlocks were the guns that founded the country in the Revolution and War of 1812, and even before that in the French and Indian War, kind of set us up. So to go out and take game with one or just shoot one is truthfully an amazing experience that even if flintlocks are not your thing, if you call yourself a muzzleloader enthusiast, you should at least have some range time with one. I personally think every American should at least shoot a flintlock once. There's something just cool about them. Now, the other big advantage with them is you're not trying to source primers or percussion caps. Now, the components used to make percussion caps and modern primers are, I believe, fairly similar. I'm not a chemist. So, and if you've been involved in the shooting sports in the last couple of years, you know how hard primers and ammunition have been. Primers were also subject to this. So there were times when actually finding primers or percussion caps was very hard. That is not the case with a flintlock. If you have a good flintlock, it will ignite your main charge powder. Now, I use 4F, which I'll be discussing that in future videos on this series. But you can use your main powder. So really, if you have, like for a 50 cal muzzleloader, if you have 3F powder, your lead balls, and a flint, that's all you need. And flints can be sourced, and I haven't seen a shortage of them. I'm not saying it won't happen, but even if there are, I mean, you can find flint. It's a naturally occurring thing. So that's a great thing about that. I mean, arguably a flintlock is the best survival rifle if you really want to get down to the basics of making all your own stuff. Trying to find the ingredients to make primers and percussion caps, that's a very difficult thing. I know there's probably someone who does it, and it's probably very dangerous too. But those are the advantages of the flintlock. Now, the advantages of the percussion, probably the biggest one for most people is you don't have the flash. Now, I just said the flash is definitely a cool factor, but from an accuracy standpoint, that can take time to getting used to. I will admit I struggled with that myself. Where that flash happens, you want to move right as the ball is coming out of the barrel, and then it sends your shot 6 inches in the wrong direction, causing you to miss the target, miss the deer, whatever. It's something that you have to practice with if you're shooting a flintlock. That is, the experience of shooting a percussion is a lot more inclined to that of a modern rifle. The other advantage, they are slightly more reliable. And I think that with a quality flintlock, they're very close actually, because I've had plenty of misfires with percussions. But they might not be as subject to moisture, things like that, as much as a flintlock. They're not like a cartridge gun, neither of them is, but they might edge out the flintlock a little bit, from my experience. Some people might say there's a huge difference, other people might say there's not a big difference at all, but I think that's, in my opinion, it is a slight advantage. And the last thing I want to discuss with an advantage of the percussion is you can get away with a cheaper lock. Now, there's two types of locks you will find internally. Now, all the originals had a flat spring like this, or I should say most. There might be some exception that I'm not aware of. They have a flat spring like this, and that gives a lot of force, and does very well. You also have some with coil springs, which you can see now is a smaller lock, but they don't quite generate the speed, which generates less spark. So a flintlock with a coil spring, in my opinion, is not a good idea and can cause issues. In a percussion, as long as it has enough force to hit that little cap, I'm fairly certain this one has a coil spring lock. Gun will go off fine, no issue. So yeah, that's the advantage of a cap lock over a flintlock. So when it comes to the barrel, the first question you gotta ask yourself is, do you want rifled or do you want smooth bore? Now, the main advantage of a smooth bore is that you can shoot shot in it. And if that's something that you want to do, that's, get a smooth bore. But if you're mainly looking to hunt deer and animals like that, a rifle is going to be more accurate. Now, I know there's going to be the guy in the comments who's going to say, oh, I can shoot my smoothbore out to 200 yards offhand with my foot tied behind my leg. Okay, cool. But for the average person, a smoothbore, yes, they can shoot okay, but they are significantly harder to shoot well than a rifle. So, if you want to hunt with it, or you want to target shoot with it, I'll definitely go rifled. And when it comes to caliber, so a smaller caliber is going to use less powder and be cheaper for the lead to use. So if you're casting your own bullets, you'll use less lead for the smaller balls, or if you're buying them, the balls will be cheaper. Right now, I looked it up, a 36 caliber lead balls for 100 is $6 cheaper than what you'd shoot in a 50 caliber. So that's something to consider. But obviously a bigger bore is going to mean more energy downrange. And one thing you definitely need to consider is what are your state laws for hunting. If you want to hunt deer, I know in Pennsylvania, I believe it's 44 minimum caliber. So it has to be a 44 caliber or bigger. And from a hunting ethics standpoint, I actually agree with them on that rule. Yes, smaller calibers have killed deer historically, but you have a better chance of wounding them and not finding the animal. So for hunting, I think a 50 caliber is a great option, or 45 is fine too. But a 50 caliber, you have a better chance of finding balls at your local sporting goods store if you're not casting your own. So that's a factor. And also there's a larger variety of guns that come in 50 caliber than others. So if you plan on hunting deer, that would be my go-to, I think. And now if you want to hunt bigger animals, elk, moose, bear, stuff like that, I would consider going with a larger caliber, maybe 58 or 62 caliber. But if you're mainly interested in plinking, you're not a big hunter, I personally think 36 is a great option. Now, I'm not a fan of 32s because you have 5/16 ramrods would be really tight if they would go in at all. So you'd probably have to deal with custom ramrod and custom ramrod accessories. But with a 36, you can still use a 5/16 ramrod. They use half the powder of a 50. And they also use cheap, like I said earlier, cheaper balls, less lead. If you're casting your own bullets, if you want to cast 100, you'll use a fraction of the lead that you would on casting 50 cal balls. So I think for plinking, a 36 is a great option. I consider them the 22 of the flintlock world. So that's my thought on caliber. Now when it comes to barrel length and swamped or not swamped, that is very much a personal choice. Now, a longer barrel will give you more velocity, but it's also going to be less maneuverable and heavier as compared to something with a shorter barrel. So I guess if you're going to be hiking through the Rockies and going over into like little caves and stuff, and that maybe a shorter barrel, lighter gun would be better. But that's all personal preference. When it comes to the swamp or straight barrel, I definitely like the swamp better. And I think most people do agree, but there are people I know who don't, that a swamp barrel balance is better. But one thing with that is I don't think a lot of factory guns like your Thompson Centers come with swamp barrels. So if you want a swamp barrel, you kind of have to go the custom gun or the kit gun like the Kibler or the Chambers kit options. So that's definitely a factor there. And when it comes to what style of your stock you want, Again, that's very much personal preference, but make sure you get something that fits you, not that looks cool. There's been many times when I've heard of people getting a stock that they bought it because it looks really cool. Maybe it'll be super skinny, real thin, slender, beautiful gun, but then it's not comfortable to shoot. That can definitely be an issue. So I would definitely make sure it fits you well and is a comfortable gun. And then when patch boxes and, fancy wood, that's pretty much all going to come down to budget. They serve, like the patch boxes serve a minimal function. Yeah, you can store cleanings and stuff like that in there, but, it's really, do you have the budget for it? Is it something you want to spend money on? And I can't answer that for you. And then the next thing, and sights are the same thing. That's really, you kind of got to try out different sights. I will say if you can get one that have a standard size dovetail that gives you the option of changing it out, that can definitely be a good option, something to look into. So if you want to try, maybe you want to go to a buckhorn or you want to get rid of a buckhorn, that's great. If you're building a competition gun, I do think peep sights are the way to go if the competition you're planning on shooting allows them. And next, I do also want to touch on set triggers versus simple single triggers. I find a well-tuned single trigger, even an average one, is plenty adequate for hunting. And set triggers add another complexity to the gun. Like this screw and stuff needs adjusted at times, and I've already had a couple people that I know had to come to me to have their set trigger adjusted. So that's definitely a factor there. And like I said, for hunting, recreational shooting, I don't think the complexity and the extra cost associated with a set trigger is worth it in my opinion. Now on my target rifle, I do have a set trigger on that, and I do like that. It's for shooting bullseye, it does make sense. So I would say unless you're planning on shooting competition, I wouldn't mess around with set triggers. But now I'm going to touch on not so much brands, but when you're getting your first muzzleloader, what are the best options? I would say if you either have the skills yourself or you have the money to afford a custom build, that is by far a great option. But I also understand if you're getting into the hobby, you might not want to spend the money or the time and resources to get a custom gun. Which really, if you want to start building them, the tools you're going to have in it, you're probably going to be spending the same amount on a custom gun when all's said and done. But if that's the part of the hobby you want to get into, I think that's a great thing. Or to support a local builder or a custom builder, that's also great. Going to a show like the Gunmakers Fair or the 18th Century Artisan Show and talking to a builder and either buying one off his table or having him build you one. I think that's a very great option, but it's a very expensive option, and I realize personally that wouldn't be something in my budget. I think the next best option would probably be a Kibler kit. Now, you can look them up, Kibler long rifles. They use all premium parts, and they have kits that are right around the $1,000 to $1,100 mark, which is only a little more than like a good Thompson Center. So that's a great option. Now, you do have a little bit of work, but it's mainly sanding and staining, not a lot of fitting, pretty easy to build, won't take you long. You don't need a full workshop full of tools to build one. So I think they're a great option. And then this is a Pedersoli. I can say I'm personally happy with Parasoli for the Brown Best kit I did. And they do make completed guns, and I wouldn't be afraid to try another one of their guns if that's something you want. When it comes to other brands, you know, Thompson Center, CVA Traditions, I have minimal experience with them. And I can't give you a solid opinion, but I will say if you want to go real budget, cap lock is better for that because of the lock. And that might be a good place to get started, but I think if you can afford a Kibler kit or a Petrosoli, that would be better. And Thompson Centers have a pretty good reputation. But those are kind of the characteristics I would suggest considering when buying your first muzzleloader. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and have a good day.